and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Systemic terrorism continues in the occupied territories as Zionist settler colonialists wreak more havoc against Palestinians. Armed settlers opened fire indiscriminately and burned homes and vehicles. More Palestinians were attacked, crops and land burned, all under the protection of the Zionist military. This is being done while the Zionists are trying to usurp more Palestinian lands with their expansion of illegal settlements. And of course, this apartheid regime is continually allowed to operate with terrorism as its modus operandi, as a so-called international community does nothing. Well, I'd like to welcome my guests to this program. Khalid Barakat, spokesperson, Masar Badil movement out of Vancouver. Zafar Bangash, Director, Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought out of Toronto. Thank you both for being with me. Let's start this off in Vancouver. And Khalid, I mean, why do you think that we're seeing an increase of the settler violence and on an almost daily basis, at least one Palestinian being killed by regime forces?
Well, I think that what's happening today in Palestine is we are witnessing in daily attacks by Israeli settlers with the full protection and cover of the Israeli Zionist army. Now, it's very important to understand that these settlers are basically paramilitary and mercenaries. Most of them, they come from New York and Berlin, Paris, cities in the West. They are continuing the Israeli settler project in Palestine as it was founded, 75 years ago, and even before that. When we look at who actually established this settler colonialist regime of Israel, it was settlers, just like the one in the West Bank and in all of Palestine, really, because we do not differentiate between colonies in the West Bank and colonies in Al-Naqab, for example, or in Haifa. The nature of this regime is based on a settler colonialist nature, and what guides settler is a theme. More land and less Arabs. They want to grab more land and they want to see less Palestinians in Palestine. And this is a systematic policy that Israel uses in order to actually push Palestinians on the policy they call slowly transfer, which means not just building settlements and colonies in the West Bank, but also evacuate more Palestinians. We see this goes hand in hand. When you look at Israeli bulldozers, destroying Palestinian homes, you will see the same bulldozers building Israeli colonies. So this is very important to see. We also need to understand that this is completely business and profit for Israeli companies who are complicit in this basically the industry of settlements, because they give Israeli companies all kinds of contracts in order to, so everyone is actually complicit in this, whether the Israeli government, whether the settler organizations, or whether the Zionist movement in Europe and in North America, with full protection of US government and European governments. And this entire system shows clearly the nature of Israel as a colonialist settler project.
Okay, well, I want to touch on part of what you said a little bit later about the support system coming out of Europe and North America. But let me get Zafar involved in this conversation. Zionist settlers have defiled a mosque, entering it with a dog and even tearing up Qur'ans. And this shows their sheer hatred and racism against Muslims, against Palestinians in general. So I want to talk about the lack of condemnation. We always hear about religious tolerance and respect, especially coming out of the Canadian capital or United States or England. So what's going on here? Why is it a different framework when it comes to the Palestinians?
Well, I think we need to be clear about the fact that because Zionist Israel is a colonial settler entity, and the vast majority of people that are involved in this colonial enterprise, they are from North America, including Canada and Europe, and they are the kith and kin of these people. And that's why no crime that Israel perpetrates, whether it's the so called settlers, in fact, we should not call them settlers, they are illegal squatters, uh, or the Zionist army or its police forces, they are all involved in this enterprise of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people from their lands. And for the Palestinians, the Nakba has not ended. It occurred 75 years ago, but it's been continuing now as well for the last 75 years. And what these so called settlers have demonstrated is that they have no regard whatsoever for the sentiments of the Palestinian people. They barge into mosques, including Masjid al Aqsa, which is the third holiest place for the Muslims. They barge in with their filthy boots. They take, in this latest attack that they carried out, there were dogs that were taken into the mosque, and they tore copies of the Quran. And as you asked as to why there is silence in the West, it is because these criminals that are involved in these activities are kith and kin of the West. And the West in general and the United States in particular wants to continue to have turmoil in that region because it then helps in their arms sales to that region because Zionist Israel continues to create instability. So there are two aspects to it. One is the internal situation in Palestine, and the other is the external dimension of support that is provided to the Zionist criminal enterprise of colonial settlers. Internally, of course, the Israelis keep on pushing the Palestinians out of their land by killing them, by ethnically cleansing them. For instance, in the West Bank, there are something like 600 to 700,000 illegal squatters in the West
Yes.
Bank, and they usurp the overwhelming majority of the choicest land, of water. In fact, 90% of the water in the West Bank is utilized by these 700,000 Zionist squatters, whereas the only 10% of the water of the West Bank is left for about 2.8 million Palestinians. So one can begin to see that this entire project is based upon ethnically cleansing the Palestinians of their land.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, you have these external powers, the Europeans, with the exception of perhaps Ireland, that has been supportive of the Palestinian cause, but the United States in particular, that pumps in billions of dollars into this parasitical state to continue its aggressive policies. And any crime that they commit, these people remain completely silent because that is exactly what they want. They don't
Yes.
care about others' rights. They don't care about the Palestinians' rights. They don't care about religion or anything. It's just that this advances the West's agenda in that region as well.
Well, Khaled, we've heard some statements by Israeli security chiefs this time around, actually calling the settler attacks on Palestinian villages as nationalist terrorism. So, your thoughts about that? Why do you think this time around they have actually condemned it in this way?
Well, I think, they're trying to play bad cop, good cop kind of policy, but Netanyahu, it's just like he's just like Ben Gvir. It's just the other coin of Ben Gvir. And the government today in Israel is the only thing that it's keeping it intact is the forces that represent the settlers project, particularly Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and others. And we see that these open calls from Israeli ministers to, he said, even if we have to kill thousands, Basically, this is the same phrases that settlers in Palestine in the 30s and 40s used when they committed hundreds of massacres that led to a Nakba of 1948 and the displacement of the vast majority of the Palestinian people. What they want to do now is to, as your guest said, that a Nakba did not stop and it's continuing. And what they want to do is to create another major catastrophe for the Palestinian people by pushing Palestinians to leave their villages. These settlers, when you look at these settlements, every Palestinian village today in the West Bank is surrounded by 3 or 4 settlements right on the hills of the West Bank and the mountains looking down at Palestinian villages and towns. And they feel that they can actually displace Palestinians from the West Bank, and they say that publicly, that if they want, they can go to Jordan. And we see, for example, today the United States said that they are going to seize some of the funds that they provide for organizations in the settlements, which means that the United States actually funds settlers and settlements, and they have been doing so. And now they're just kind of trying to practice some pressure for media consumptions. But what it actually says is that the United States provide material support for these paramilitary gangs that they call themselves, settlers. They are, when you look at any Israeli colony or settlement in the West Bank, what they have there is a military training camp. They have a prison. They have, arsenal. They're well-trained, military trained, and some of them served in the Canadian forces, the United States forces, French forces, German army, and many of them don't even speak Hebrew. That's why they're kind of mercenaries and they're paramilitary and they act like a shield for the Zionist project. And that's why the Palestinian resistance said any settler in the West Bank or in Palestine is a legitimate target for the Palestinian resistance. These settlers are a legitimate target for the Palestinian resistance because they are worse than even the organized Israeli army. The other thing that Israel depends on settlers to carry crimes because there is no one to blame. And they can always say, well, it's not the government of Israel who did this, it's settlers who are angry. And basically they're trying to play a complementary role, the army and the settlers, in terms of attacking Palestinians and achieving the goals of the Zionist project. Now, I think they are failing miserably because Palestinians are not going anywhere. And Palestinians, even under the most harsh conditions in Gaza, under 15 years of siege, the Palestinian resistance is growing and the Palestinian people are not leaving Palestine. They know, Palestinians, they understand that they must be steadfast, they must uphold to their land, their farms, their villages and towns, and they feel that this is not just a battle between them and the Israeli settlers or the Zionist regime, but Palestinians feel that they are the forefront for the Arab and Muslim nations and for the people of the region.
Okay.
And so they have a responsibility to be steadfast.
Right. Well, what about that, Zafar? Because we have seen some mixed statements coming out of the Israeli regime, as I had mentioned, about the security chiefs and trying to basically condemn some of these settlement attacks. Do you think that that's because of fear? I mean, Khalid has just talked about the resistance and how steadfast the resistance is. And of course, they're expecting blowback as they have become more and more violent against the Palestinians over the last several weeks. Do you think the fear factor is part of it? While we're trying, sometimes we see this sort of good cop, bad cop act with them, actually security chiefs of all people, sort of condemning this as national terrorism. Or how do you see it, Zafar?
Well, there is no doubt that they are playing this good cop, bad cop routine in order to deflect criticism from the Zionist regime. But as your guest pointed out, that the Zionist regime is supporting these settlers. They are, they have served in the military. They continue to serve. They have weapons, etc. So that's one dimension of it. Although I would say that yes, there is no doubt that there is a fear factor involved, because despite the extreme brutalities of the Zionist occupiers for more than 75 years, they have not been able to subdue the Palestinian people. In fact, to the great credit of the Palestinian people, they're virtually unarmed, and yet they are able to resist these criminal Zionist terrorists with virtually nothing in their hands, and they are able to face these barbarians and are still able to inflict some punishment upon them. It is important to keep in mind that under international law, people under occupation have the right to resist their occupiers by whatever means necessary. This has been repeatedly enunciated by United Nations General Assembly resolutions, not Security Council resolutions, regrettably, because anytime such resolutions come before the Security Council, the United States is there to veto these resolutions, so Israel is protected. But the General Assembly, which represents the will of the international community of 193 countries, has on two occasions stated quite categorically that people under occupation have the right to resist their occupiers. And we have seen this resistance growing stronger, not only in the tiny Gaza Strip, which is besieged, but also in Jenin and in Nablus and now in other areas. I mean, it is to the immense credit of the Palestinian people that they have not surrendered to the Zionist terrorist campaign. In fact, it's a test of will between the Palestinians and the Zionists. And to their great credit, the Palestinians have shown themselves to be extremely courageous. And I would like to add that it is now up to the rest of the Muslim world, the Muslims around the world, that they should not only simply express solidarity with the suffering Palestinian people, but to provide them material support so that they can continue to resist these Zionist criminals and drive them out of Palestine, and force a system whereby all the people, Palestinians, whether they are Muslims or Christians, as well as Jews who are the original, those who were there originally in Palestine, they can live as equal citizens under the law, not these alien invaders from Europe, North America, etc., that have inundated that land and are basically killing innocent Palestinians, particularly children. I mean, when you look at the statistics, it's horrendous. This year alone, in 2023 up to the present time, more than 170 Palestinians have been killed. That includes 30 children. Yes. And in fact, some Israeli writers have written about it, U.C. Klein and, in the Haaretz, etc. But unfortunately for these Zionist criminals, Palestinian lives do not matter, and therefore the Palestinians are forced to resist the occupiers, and that has put fear of God into the minds of these people.
Well, Khalid, what do you think it's going to take? I mean, Zafar talked about the 193 members of the General Assembly and how the majority of them actually, more and more, they're being very vocal about actually the Palestinian situation. But of course, at the end of the day, it's the Security Council in the United States or UK that vetoes whatever they want to do against the Israeli regime. But we are seeing from the global south, from different parts of the world, from Africa, from West Asia, more and more support for the Palestinian cause. What is it going to take to actually, on the international level, then break this control by these Western regimes in support of Tel Aviv in order to actually force the hand of that regime?
Well, I think that the United Nations and the international, so-called international community, they have issued hundreds of resolutions calling for Israel to stop settlements, calling for not to expand settlements, considering the apartheid wall to be illegal, and all that. But the problem is that these international resolutions does not have any teeth when it comes to Israel, because as you mentioned, the United States veto is ready to diffuse any kind of real international efforts. We know that the United States used its veto power, over 45 times throughout the conflict. Anytime that Israel needs a protection on the international level, you are going to see Germany, France, Britain, United States, Australia supporting Israel, including Canada. And now why is that? Why is also these particular countries like US, Canada, and, is because these are colonialist powers as well. Canada is a settler colonialist state, and it doesn't want anyone to remind the world that what Israel is doing, they did this.
So is it basically, Khaled, sorry to interrupt you, I'm just about out of time. So basically, is it resistance is the only way to victory for the Palestinian people?
The only way, and to defeat the United States and the Western powers in West Asia and our region, because that's the problem. Israel wouldn't exist without the full funding of the United States, Canada, Germany, and France. This Western powers needs to be defeated, and the only way to be defeated is through our resistance in the region and internationally, in a resistance camp led by Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all of the resistant forces of our region.
Okay, and on that note, I'd like to thank both of you for being with me. Khaled Barakat, spokesperson, Masar Badal Movement out of Vancouver. Zafar Bangash, Director, Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought out of Toronto. And as always, viewers, it's a pleasure having you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashimi, signing out for myself and all the group right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.